Hello? Hey. How's everybody? Can we turn on the middle lights just so I can see this? Thank you. Okay, so we have 1 hour exactly until the Super Bowl turns on this screen. So as soon as it cuts on, y'all can stay and watch, y'all can leave. I actually looked up today, there's betting lines on how many times Taylor Swift is going to appear on the screen. So right now it's trending in between 6 and 7. So place your bets. All right, so we're starting a new book tonight, the book of Job. So y'all can turn there. It's in the Bible. We're going to... All right. It is in the Bible, yep. So if you brought one of those, it's in there. I was starting to say it's in the Bible here in the chart. In the English Bible, the English Bible is sectioned out chronologically, but also really by genre. And so you see Job here is one of the wisdom and poetry books. I don't know if y'all have read Job before or if it's been a while since you've read it. But in the Hebrew Bible, things are divided a little differently. If you look at this one, we remember back when we were studying through the minor prophets, so you kind of have the law, the prophets, and the writings. And basically the story goes up until the people of Israel fall into exile, and then the story pauses. And y'all remember, if you're here during the prophets' time, that the prophets tell us why everything that just happened. So then next we have this section of writings, this basically, while the story's paused, is telling us, basically, it's teaching us about God, but also teaches us about ourselves. Like thinking about the Psalms and the Proverbs, they're teaching us how to worship God with all of our emotions, but especially in some really complex and confusing scenarios. So for instance, one big message throughout the Psalms and Proverbs is this: the righteous flourish and the wicked perish. It's a big message throughout the Psalms and the Proverbs. Righteous, if you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad, basically. So you can see that in Psalms like Psalm 92. You can see it in Proverbs like this one, Proverbs 1. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and be at ease without dread of disaster. So in general, that's what the Psalms and Proverbs teach. If you do good, you get good. Now, is that generally true? Yes. Does that always happen? No. Well, we see it all the time where that doesn't happen. And we remember that Proverbs aren't promises. They're just true principles that generally work out that way. Then you have these books like Job and Ecclesiastes that say, life's not always that simple. Sometimes bad things happen. And that's really what's at the heart of the book of Job. It's one of life's biggest questions, which is, why do bad things happen to good people? And that's what we're going to wrestle with for the next 4 weeks. This is not going to be a verse-by-verse take on Job. It's going to be an overview. I think we're doing 4 weeks in Job, so we're going to cover big chunks. I'm just going to go the first 3 chapters tonight, so we're going to move fast. But just to give you an overview, you're going to see the book introduces Job, who is a man who is righteous on all fronts, all accounts, but he experiences some of the worst suffering ever known to man. Y'all remember he loses all of his children and all of his wealth in one afternoon, and then his health is struck, and he's left without any answers as to why did this happen. And then the bulk of the book is exploring that question. Why'd this happen? And you got these speeches between Job and his 3 friends that are arguing. The 3 friends are arguing a very biblical idea. If you do good, you get good. You must have done something bad because you're getting bad. The righteous flourish and the wicked perish. Now, Job doesn't see a backstory as to why he's suffering, but we do. So we're going to look at that backstory in chapter 1. All right? So everybody in the book of Job, it's in the Bible. So book of Job is right before Psalms. We're going to start chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. He'd rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. Because Job said, "It might be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Job did this continually. All right, what do we learn about Job? We learn 4 big facts here. We get his name, which is pretty insignificant. He doesn't even have a genealogy. Like, we don't hear who his dad is or what his line is. It's not really that important. We learn where he's from. He's not from Israel. He's from the land of Uz. It's really not important where he's from. Job may or may not be Hebrew. When did Job live? That's pretty important. You know, you might have heard that Job's the oldest book in the Bible. Well, we don't know definitively when he lived, but there's some clues. If you look here, this is a timeline. We're going to zoom in on it a little bit. I don't know why they misspelled patriarchs, but they sure did. But you can see here, you got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, going down, Saul, David, Solomon, all this, and you got some of the books here. We can get a clue on when Job lived from some of the references within the books, like this. He doesn't reference any kings. Like a lot of the books, if they live in the time of kings, they'd say in the 6th year of King so-and-so. So it's probably before the kings, pre-king, all right? He doesn't mention the law. He doesn't mention Mount Sinai. He doesn't mention the promised land or Egypt or anything like that, so it's probably before all of that. One thing that's funny is Job himself, if you just saw in those verses, he offers sacrifices. So this is probably before all of the priesthood, all of those sorts of laws too. So we're kind of narrowing in on a date. And when we get... He doesn't mention promises to Abraham. We see that one of his friends talks about God speaks to us through dreams. We can take some hints from his lifespan, from the nomadic tribes that are mentioned, from the currency names. He probably lived at or before the time of Abraham. So really old, and that's kind of important to the theology that we'll see in the book. Because these guys are really operating on that, if you do good, you get good. And a lot of the ideas of the righteous suffering are pretty foreign to these guys. So I think that his setting, it makes this story so much better. Because him being outside of Israel and being this early, he probably doesn't know that much about God. You know, you see these Old Testament, these ancient men like Noah and Abraham who, not knowing a ton about the Lord, they trusted the Lord greatly. And Job is cut from that same cloth. Third thing we learned about Job, Job is godly. The place and time aren't that important. What the author focuses in on is he's blameless and upright. He's one who fears God and turns away from evil. So he's a man of integrity. He's not perfect, but he's blameless. And that context is important because what his friends are going to argue, in fact, in Job 8:20, his friend Bildad, he's going to claim God's not going to reject a blameless man. But here, and Bildad's insinuating, Job, you got some secret sin. But we're told from the get-go, Job does not have any secret sin. He's blameless. He's so godly that he not only personally turns away from evil, but he's sacrificing for his kids. Think about it. He's so dialed in as a parent that he knows that his kids aren't sinning externally, but just in case they might have sinned in their hearts, Job stands in the gap and he's offering sacrifices for them because he knows purity isn't only what we do with our hands, it's what we do in our hearts, you know? And so Job is a really great, a really godly man. And I think it's worth, pausing, those of y'all in the room that are parents, and taking note here that Job rose early in the morning, making sacrifices for his children. I think it's worth noting that what blameless parenting looks like is waking in the morning and praying over your kids. Job's a godly man. Number 4, we learned that Job is super rich. Richest guy in all the East, it says. Tons of animals, tons of servants, 10 kids total. All right? That's the setting. Let's go into verse 6. All right, this is a confusing verse. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." Hold up. What are we talking about here? This scene seems so weird. The sons of God, who's that? It's probably angels, right? They're lower than God. This isn't like a council where God is a God among many gods or something like that. You have God as supreme, and then you have these lower, the sons of God, that are kind of like a heavenly governing cabinet almost. Like God's the supreme one, but he might rule and give orders out to a lot of supernatural powers, a lot of angels. So why the heck is Satan there? Why would he be in heaven? Some people say that Satan's like a party crasher. He came in like an uninvited guest, but I don't think that's the case. If you look in 1 Kings 22, the prophet Micaiah, he describes a heavenly council like this, and he says that in that council, a lying spirit stood up and said to the Lord, let me go out and do this and this and this, and the Lord sends this lying spirit to go out and lie to someone. All right? So make no mistake, God can use and does use evil for his good purposes, whether that is human evil or supernatural evil. We also learn here that Satan is not autonomous, right? He's on a leash. He can only do what God allows him to do. God is totally in control. Now, some may argue, man, Satan can't be up in heaven. Like, God can't have any fellowship with darkness. Agreed. God can't have fellowship with darkness, but this seems more like governance, all right? It's okay if this scene doesn't sit well with you. It didn't sit well with me. When I read this, I was like, why is Satan up there, and why is God giving him, I think it's supposed to not sit well with us, and I'll explain that later. But especially what Satan was allowed to do. That doesn't sit well with us, and I think it's not supposed to. All right, keep in mind, we have insight into this heavenly conversation. Job does not. He has no clue what's going on there. He is just doing his own thing. He doesn't know about Satan and God's conversation, all right? So the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's nobody like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. All right, so the author has already said this, but now you have God himself saying this about Job. Here's my question. Why in the world is God going to bring up Job to Satan? You know what I mean? Like God put Satan's crosshairs on Job. I heard one pastor say, he said it's like this guy owns a jewelry store and he sees a robber come in and he's like, hey, what are you doing? He's like, just trying to steal some diamonds. And he's like, oh, cool. Have you seen the biggest one? Come on. Why in the world, if he knows Satan's like, I'm just roaming around trying to trip somebody up, and he's like, oh, let me show you the best guy. Pretty amazing, though, that God calls Job blameless and upright and my servant. It's the same title that he uses for prophets and patriarchs and Moses. It's a title that conveys dignity and honor. In his eyes, Job is blameless and upright. Have you noticed Job? The adversary has noticed. Look at verse 9. Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Haven't you put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You bless the work of his hands. His possessions have increased the land. You stretch out your hand and touch everything that he has, and he will curse you to your face. Satan is preaching the prosperity gospel. Think about it. What's Satan saying? Man, of course Job fears you. He is rich. He's good to go. Of course he's upright. He's got it figured out. If he lives like this, he gets a wife, he gets money, he gets wealth, he gets kids, he gets possessions, he gets protection. Satan's essentially saying, God, Job doesn't love you for you. Job loves you for the blessings that you give him. If you take away the blessings, if you let me squeeze him, he's going to curse you to his face. Now, it's a bold claim from Satan because he's not just saying something about Job, he's saying something about God. What he's insinuating is, you aren't worthy of worship, not by yourself, not without the blessings. John Piper said this first truth undid me. I saw how linear my functional theology was. And if I worshiped God and obeyed him, I expected him to give me what I wanted. If I remained faithful through one big trial, then he wouldn't keep letting me suffer. In my mind, the reward for following Jesus was a prosperous, fruit-filled, blessing-laden, trouble-free life. But as I saw in Job, God himself is the reward. Listen to this. When we turn away from God in suffering, questioning his love and care, we are agreeing with Satan that God's value is tied to the material blessings he gives us. And that is an immeasurable assault on God's worth. That's big. Man, for real, how often do we live as if we got a flow chart for God's behavior? You know, like we got God figured out. Okay, if I obey, he's going to give me blessings. I'm going to get what I want. If I'm faithful in the trial, he'll stop the trial. We never say it out loud, but internally, we kind of feel that way sometimes. But man, that sentence, he said, when we turn away from God and suffering, we are agreeing with Satan that God's value is tied to the material blessings he gives us. Man, that's staggering. Because what it's saying is, if God doesn't give blessings and stop suffering, he's useless. That's Satan's idea. God alone isn't worthy of worship. In my mind, the book of Job answers two huge questions. The first one, and this is the main one, the focus of the book for me, is can I trust God? That's the big question that the book of Job answers in my mind. The second one is answered right here is God alone worthy of worship? Like, is his worth dependent on his gifts? Now, we know that it's not. We see it even in the New Testament. There's a verse, 1 Peter 1. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved through various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That New Testament verse is teaching us that trials are necessary to, one, make us better, and two, result in the praise and glory and honor of God. AKA, God is going to be praised when it's publicly seen that he is worthy of worship when all gifts are removed, when all blessing is removed. Satan doesn't want to just test Job and accuse Job. He is testing and accusing God. Let's go verse 12. All right, y'all understand where we're at? Have you seen Job? He's doing all right, man. He's great. He loves me. He turns away from evil. And Satan says, yeah, he's rich. Of course he turns away from evil. He's got things figured out. If you let me squeeze him, he's going to curse you to your face. Verse 12. Here's the crazy part. The Lord said to Satan, behold, everything he has is in your hand. Only against him don't stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So God grants him, all right, squeeze him. All right, so I'm going to sum up what happens next. Job's in his house. He's hanging out in his house. He does not know about the heavenly conversation. He is just being faithful, offering sacrifices for his kids. And all of a sudden, this guy runs in the house, one of his servants, and he's like, Job, I'm sorry, man. I was out in the field. I was taking care of the oxen and the donkeys, and an army came in, the Sabians, and they killed all of the servants, and they took away all the ox, all the donkeys. I'm the only one that's left alive. And while he's still talking, another dude runs in. He runs in. He's like, Job, man, I'm sorry. I was out watching the sheep, and fire fell from heaven and burned all of the sheep and all of the servants, and I alone have survived. And while he's still talking, another guy runs in and he's like, Job, I'm sorry. I was taking care of the camels, and this army comes in, kills every one of the servants but me, and they took all the camels. I'm the only one that's left. And while he's still talking, another servant runs in. He's like, Job, your kids were in the house, and the wind came out of nowhere, and it crumbled the house. Job, all 10 of your kids just died. 1 minute, his entire life is ruined. All of his wealth, all of his kids, his whole world, everything is destroyed in a minute. Now, we've all suffered, but not like that. How's Job going to respond? That's the question that all of heaven and all of hell is waiting to see. Is he going to curse God? Is he going to curse God? Look at verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and, say it, worshiped. That's one of the craziest sentences in the Bible, isn't it? Satan said, man, Job's going to curse you to your face. Job mourns. He shaves his head. He tears his clothes, but he worships. Look at what he says. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That is wild. Man, this guy Job, we do not give him enough credit. Think about his faithfulness right here. And it's crazy, though, that he acknowledges God is the one that gives the gifts, and he confesses God himself is the one that took away all these things. God took away my kids. How does that sit with you? It's uncomfortable. Just like Satan in heaven. It's like, I think it's supposed to be uncomfortable. I'll explain why in just a minute. But acknowledging that God did this wasn't sin on Job's part. God says that. God took my kids away, and he's still worthy of worship. Job passes the test. Here's one interesting thing to note, that throughout the book, there's a lot of arguments as to why this happened, but nobody's arguing that God was in charge of it. To the man, every character in the book, every friend says, God's in charge. God did this. God's sovereign. All right? Again, there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came from among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's nobody like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Same praise from God about Job. Pause and appreciate for a second that God is proud of Job. I think we get this idea sometimes that God's like sitting up there waiting for us to mess up. He's proud of Job. He loves the faithfulness of his children. Like when we obey him, it brings him joy. He's our Father. And so he praises Job again. And I think the repeated praise is a little dig on Satan, like your plan didn't work. And God says, have you noticed Job? He still holds fast his integrity, even though you wanted to destroy him for no reason. Now, that doesn't mean for no purpose, right? Because I think what God's saying is, if you look at Job's life, there's no rational explanation for this suffering, but we know that's what the book of Job wrestles with, that his friends are going to argue, hey, there's a reason in your actions that you're suffering, but really they overlook the fact that there's purpose in God's actions that allow Job's suffering. Does that make sense? They're all looking for something you did to earn this suffering, looking for a reason, and God's saying there's no reason like that, but there's purpose. We're going to see the purpose. Verse 4. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, all that a man has he'll give for his own life. Stretch out your hand and touch his bone, touch his flesh, then he'll curse you to your face." All right, so obviously Satan has underestimated Job, so he comes with a new strategy. Essentially, there's a difference between what a man has and who he is. If the inner man's still untouched, he can rebuild. You've taken his comfort, you've taken his family, but hurt him. Hurt him. He's been protected. Hurt him, he'll curse you to your face. And at this point, if you've never read the book before, you would think, well, God's not going to do that. Right? He already passed the test. Of course, God's not going to do that. Verse 6, and the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he's in your hand, just spare his life." Why would God do that? I mean, from the beginning, he could have said, "Satan, get the heck out of here. I know how this is going to end. We're not going to put Job through all that." At this point, he could say, "Hey, he passed your test. We're good to go. I'm worthy of worship. Job's upright. We're good to go." Seriously, everything inside of us, the first time I read this, I was thinking, man, he is a good man to begin with. He passed the test. He worshiped when his kids were killed. Leave him alone. Seriously. Why does God allow Satan to hurt him further? I think we are supposed to feel uncomfortable with this. I think it's not supposed to feel good. What's God doing? So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in ashes. This time it's not the Sabians or fire. It's Satan himself that's personally striking Job. Unimaginable suffering. Can you imagine sores from the top of your head to the bottom of your foot? Like if you stand or kneel or sit or lay down, pain. Later on in the book, they all get infected. They get worms in the sores. It's just unimaginable suffering. Here's a further test. Job's wife says to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job didn't sin with his lips, with sores all over him. Now, his wife gets a bad rap, right? Seriously, Augustine calls her the devil's assistant. Calvin calls her Satan's tool. But in reality, you got to think about this woman, because she's also lost all her wealth. She's also lost all her kids. She's suffering like Job is, and she's watching. You're upright and you're suffering. None of this makes sense. But look at Job, man. Look at how he handles her. He's kind. Look what he says. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. He's not calling her foolish. He's saying, hey, this isn't like you. That's beneath you. You're better than that. He's so kind even when he's suffering. He's being a gentle and kind leader, even under the most intense stress. Husbands, take note. Shall we receive good from God and not receive evil? Even though Satan struck him, Job's still acknowledging this suffering is from God. He still trusts God. In all the suffering and trial, Job doesn't sin with his lips. Even in acknowledging this is from God, he's right. He passed the second test. And let's just marvel at Job's faithfulness here. He loves God, not the blessings. Satan's wrong. I don't know if y'all have ever been around somebody that's been really suffering and still praising the Lord. Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful. Because what you're seeing is you're seeing a glimpse of God-given faith. You're seeing a glimpse of God, something that God gave, right? That God's worthy of worship in the most immense pain. Verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came from each his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. They raised their voices and cried. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and nobody spoke a word, for they saw that his suffering was very great. That's probably a good plan when somebody's really suffering. My pastor back home used to call it the ministry of presence. And if these guys would have just stopped there, it would have been great. They do not. They go on for about 20 chapters. But after 7 days of silence, it's Job that speaks first. Chapter 3. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived." Now, I'm not going to go on for all 26 verses of his speech, because that verse 3 sums it up. Job is lamenting the day he's born. He doesn't curse God directly, but he curses the day of his birth. And some people will give him a lot of flack here and be like, well, Job believes in a sovereign God, and maybe he's a little out of line. Maybe he's just in a lot of pain. Joseph next week is going to get into the speeches from the friends. But it's interesting to note, because the argument that's going to come is, if you're suffering, it's because you're sinning. Now, we know that's not the case. Not in this one, right? Because we've seen into the heavenly council, right? But the book of Job uses up like 20-something chapters with all these arguments, with Job going back and forth with these friends, and the friends are going, "What'd you do?" They're getting more aggressive, and Job's like, "I didn't do anything. If you've suffered, it's because you've sinned. Why spend that much time? Why take up that much Bible with those arguments?" I think it's this. I think it's because we have to work through it with Job. Because Job doesn't know, but we know it's not because of sin, so it's got to be something else. But here, it's not just Job's question. It's my question. Why is Job suffering like this? Even though I read the heavenly conversation, I'm still like, that don't make sense. Okay, here's what I think. I've mentioned this to a couple people this week, and it did not hit well with them, so I don't know. Y'all just humor me. This is my speculation. But here's what I think. There are some things in this book that are so uncomfortable. Why is Satan up there with God? Why did God point out Job? Why did God allow Job to suffer? I mean, God said Job is right, that God caused this stuff to happen, like the kids dying. Does God punish the righteous? I mean, God wasn't looking to purify Job through the trials. He's already upright, right? God doesn't need to prove anything to Satan. God knows what Job is like better than Job knows what Job is like. He could have just said, get out of here, Satan, or even not mention Job. My question is, what is God doing? I got questions. What I think it's doing is it's putting us in the exact same spot that Job's in, because that's what he says. What is God doing? I've got questions. In Job 31, he says, oh, that I had somebody to hear me. Here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. You see, the story itself, I think, it puts us in a personally uncomfortable position so that we are looking for answers like Job. I think the way that Job is written is so genius because it purposefully puts you on the journey with Job. In a sense, we enter into Job's world. Like, we get in there with him with our own struggles in reading this book. You know, Satan had said, man, Job's not going to curse you until he feels it personally, until it hurts him. I think that's the position here, is that this book is touching something deep and personal within us and is causing us to question, is God just? Is this okay? What he's doing to Job and his kids, we're being touched personally to feel Job's questions. And so Job's going to take the next 31 chapters to figure this out. And I think the reason it's so long is so that we think through it and go, does God punish the righteous? How does this work? We have to wrestle with him until God speaks. And when God speaks at the end, man, it is amazing. It's resounding. And the main point of the book to me is, we can trust God, even and especially when we don't understand. Because y'all know there is a ton we don't understand. You know what I mean? We get real high and mighty, like thinking like, well, God shouldn't have done this and shouldn't have done that. Well, I don't understand jack squat. You know, I don't understand electricity. I don't understand why humans cry. I don't understand this shirt. I don't understand my own dreams. I dreamed I was fighting a tomato once. I dreamed that Connor Long was trying to sell me a wheelbarrow full of meth once. I do like, what's going on? You know, like you don't understand your own mind. Of course we don't understand a sovereign God, and that's the point of God's speech at the end. When at the end he explains to Job, you don't understand anything. Like the foundations of the world or nature, you couldn't comprehend how I work with good and evil and sin and punishment if you tried. And the message to Job is, I'm in control and I'm good. And when Job actually sees God, he repents. He says, oh, I'm in the wrong. But he's given the answer to life's single most important question, which is, can we trust God? Absolutely we can. We can trust God. I'm not going to spoil the rest of the book for you. I'm just going to finish with 3 quick thoughts. All right? 3 quick thoughts showing we can trust God. All right? The first one is this. It's weird that we're going into Job right after like 4 weeks on heaven. You know, it's so good when we're thinking through, man, are we going to be able to fly? Are we going to like live with everybody forever? All these great thoughts, and now we're in suffering. But I think it's really good. We have to keep heaven in view when we think about suffering. Because remember, 2 weeks ago, when we talked about one of Satan's lies about heaven is that he would have us believe that any trial, any suffering here on earth that's not reversed here on earth is injustice on God's part. And what heaven teaches us really is the scales of suffering seem crushing on earth until you weigh them against the weight of glory, right? Light and momentary, Paul says. Satan would have us focus on earthly perspectives to suffering with no eternal reward in view. He's trying it out with Job. He's reinforcing it with Job's friends. Job doesn't see the heavenly counsel, and he doesn't get a full explanation on earth for why each thing happens. And on the flip side, he doesn't see heaven rejoice when he's faithful, but he trusts. And I think the book of Job is such a gift to us because it shows us God is at work even when we don't get answers here. One day, today, Job is seeing light and momentary. I got so much freedom when I realized that this isn't about me figuring out an explanation for all the mysteries. Why did God do this? Why did God do this? This is about me figuring out who I can trust. Second thought showing that we can trust God is this. Consider what we get out of Job's suffering. We get this book. We get the book of Job, and look at what it showed. It's not for nothing. Look at what the book of Job has showed us already in 3 chapters. It's shown us God has secret plans, and we don't see all the joys in heaven. We see that God delights in obedience, that God is worthy of worship outside of his blessings. We learn from this book that Satan's on a leash, that Satan's often wrong. We learn that we can be faithful, even kind in suffering. That's just so far. We got 20-something chapters left to go. Third thing, we can trust God. Third thing, and this I'll close with this about trusting God in trials, is this. Consider Jesus. Consider Jesus, because we have an extra lens to see the world through that Job didn't have, that Old Testament saints didn't have. See, in the book of Job, we're forced to enter Job's world and struggle with his questions, but we know what Job didn't, that in the craziest move in history that Jesus entered our world, that he lowered himself and entered our condition. You know what I mean? Like he entered our struggles. We don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with our weaknesses. But like Philippians said, he went from God to man, from man to the lowest of men, a servant, from the lowest of men to death, from death to the lowest of death, a cursed death. He became a curse to free us from the curse. He punished his son so that we can be free from the punishment of sin. Thoughts like that would have given Job's friend a stroke. You think, they're like, what'd you do? You done something wrong. The thought that God was punished so he could take our sin, that's a wild thought. We can see it. Consider Jesus when we talk about who can we trust. We can trust him because he doesn't just see our suffering, he suffered. That's huge. He doesn't just see our suffering, he suffered. He doesn't just make humans, he emptied himself and became one for you. And I know we'll never have all the mysteries figured out, even about this book. But I figured this out. We can trust a God like that. And that's why the book of Job is such a gift to us. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks for this book. Thank you that it's a gift. And as we go on this journey, I pray that we're humble, knowing that sin is not just something that happens to us, but something that we initiate, that we're bad. Lord, I pray that we're humble in knowing that we don't have anything figured out. I pray that we'd read this book with humility and that we'd be able to trust you in our sufferings. I thank you for giving us this book, for showing us Job and the things that he went through so that we know we can trust you. Thank you for the things you've already shown us, and I pray that you bless this study. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.